Good evening, and I welcome you to St. Ninian's Cathedral Parish and to tonight's presentation on euthanasia, what's wrong with it. We heard from our parishioners that they are seeking more information on the topic of medical assistance in death, or what we know as MAID, and seeking this information from a Catholic perspective. So this evening, we are pleased to be able to provide such information for our people through a presentation, question and answer period, and a chance for an informal chat with coffee and tea afterwards in the vestry after the main presentation. So our presenters this evening are Larry Worthen, a Catholic deacon and Executive Director of the Christian Medical and Dental Association of Canada. He will share the latest developments surrounding euthanasia in Canada and explain how we can support affected communities through the No Options, No Choice project. Reverend Dr. Phillip Cooper needs no introduction. He's a palliative care physician here at St. Martha's and an Anglican associate priest here in Antigonish. And he will be speaking about his experiences here in St. Martha's Hospital. So together they will answer those pressing questions we may have about palliative care and euthanasia. So please join me in welcoming Deacon Larry and Dr. Phillip.
Thank you very much, Father Danny. It's wonderful to be here with you. I spent the afternoon giving a brief presentation to the medical assistance, the Mission Assurance Advisory Council of St. Martha's Hospital. They deserve a tremendous amount of prayer and your support, trying to maintain the Catholic identity of that hospital, the only Catholic hospital in Nova Scotia. And I can tell you that they work extremely hard to maintain that. Tonight, I want to just take a moment and talk with you about some of the themes that I'm seeing in euthanasia in Canada. I'm going to set my watch here because I don't want to go on too long. As being a former lawyer and deacon, you know that can be a problem. I'd like to begin by just sharing a bit of my own personal story. In 2009, my father passed away. I was very close to my dad. He was a wonderful man. He sold insurance in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and he was one of those guys that everybody loved. He was a pillar of his church for 60 years. He had been an usher, which is quite an accomplishment, 60 years. And towards the end of his life, he developed cancer, squamous cell cancer in the bowl of his ear. And the plastic surgeon operated. They weren't able to get it all out, and the cancer came back, and it was determined to be inoperable. There was nothing that could be done. That cancer began to grow and eventually eroded the whole side of his head. And my dad, who was an extremely handsome man, his face became distorted, and he had a huge bandage that he had to have all over the side of his head all the time. For 2 years, he was in palliative care. And my father really never liked the hospital. He couldn't stand being in the hospital. And so he spent time at home where palliative care looked after him. And then finally, it was too much for my mother, and he had to go to hospital. Now, fortunately, I live in Halifax, in Dartmouth, and I had an employer at that time who was comfortable with me taking my work to Fredericton. So I could work from my parents' home in Fredericton and see my dad in the evenings. This was a time of tremendous growth in our friendship because we had never spent so much time together before, just the two of us. One day I was with my dad when he was talking to his palliative care physician. And I didn't realize this caught me by surprise, but my dad turned to his palliative care physician and said, I want you to do something to end my life. And the palliative care physician, who happened to be a member of the Christian Medical and Dental Association of Canada, said, Paul, you know I can't do that. It was in 2009, before the legalization of euthanasia. If that happened today, my father could have been dead within 24 hours. But at the time, they were unable to end his life. I was horrified. I thought to myself, what can I say to him? How can I help him? The first thing I wanted to say was, Dad, it's against the 10 Commandments to murder, to kill yourself. How can you even suggest that? That's what I wanted to say to him. But I prayed to the Lord to give me the words. And what the Lord helped me with was to ask questions. So I asked him, Dad, why is it that you want to die? And the answer was a sad one. He said, because I no longer have anything to give. See, my dad was a man who gave everything. He was a giver. He gave to my mother, he gave to my brother, my sister, and I. He used to call us, to give you an example, he used to call us on a Friday afternoon when he was on his way home from work, and say, when we were teenage boys, and say, boys, what do you want for supper? I'm going to the canteen. And we would say, well, we would like 2 hamburgers, 3 hot dogs, 2 French fries, and a milkshake. And that's just for each of us. And he would bring it all. That's the type of guy he was, generous, giving. Everyone knew him that way. But now he felt like he had nothing more to give. I was sad. I said, Dad, you know, now is the time for us to give to you. Now is the time for you to receive our love. Because you've been giving to us for so many years, and now is the time for you to receive and discover how much we love you. Well, we spent a lot of time talking, and I grew closer to my father than ever before in my life. We talked about everything. And I told him, you know, how sad I was that I had hurt his feelings earlier on as a teenage son. And he said that he had forgiven me for that, and he said there was nothing to forgive anyway. That's the type of generous man he was. I worked with this pastor to help him to see that he could still make a contribution. So he had made a significant donation to his church to do an addition. And the pastor and I got him out in a wheelchair with a catheter and a bag of urine and got him in the back of the car and took him to the church. When he arrived at the church, he couldn't believe how the church had been developed with this new wing that had been built on it. And members of the church who were there, they couldn't believe he was there, and he was that committed that he would come out of his deathbed to go and look at the church. And when they saw him, they were weeping and crying and hugging him, telling him how much they loved him. He began to see there that he was making a contribution even when he didn't think he was. And that day when we left the hospital, you know, we were going out in the wheelchair, and he goes, stop. So I stopped. There was a man sitting there on a park bench at the entrance to the hospital, his head down, looking very sad and dejected. So my father said to him, he said the man's name, and he said, I was sorry to hear about your wife. Turns out the reason the man was sad was because his wife had passed away. And Dad knew that and remembered that and expressed his condolences. You see, my father could still give, just in a different way. As time wore on, he got weaker and weaker. But as he got weaker and weaker, physically, he got stronger and stronger spiritually. And there were some beautiful stories of things that happened. A pastor came, the nurse came to me, and she said, Dad was very weak. And the nurse came and said, there's a guy outside, he wants to talk to your dad. Can he come in? So I went out to the guy, and he explained he had been a pastor in Fredericton. It hadn't been going well. He had been thinking about giving up his ministry. And Dad talked to him and encouraged him. He stuck with the ministry, and he was still a minister today. And he said, I just need to see him for 2 minutes. So I went in, asked Dad, can he come in? Dad goes, bring him in, sure. So the guy came in. I stayed outside in the hallway. When the man came out, he was in tears. The tears were running right down his face. He said, I've never seen anything like this before. Your father was only concerned about me. He wasn't concerned about himself. You see, even at the end, my father was continuing to witness to the love and compassion and caring concern of Jesus Christ. Now, my dad had a great sense of humor, and we were joking around even when he was close to death. And he said to me, I said to him, Dad, how will I know? How will I know when you made it to heaven? He said, don't worry, I'll come back. I don't know if that's theologically correct, Father, but... So I thought it was the morphine talking. I just let it go. But on the day of his funeral, the family was all there in the front row, and they had a beautiful picture of my dad and his ashes. And we couldn't help but just all be really sad and crying. And at the end of the service, the hymn that had been chosen was "It Is Well With My Soul." Now, this is a Baptist hymn. Maybe some of you are not familiar with it, but it really is it's a hymn of reassurance of someone who's gone through a very dark and trying time and is coming out into the light. And he's saying, "It is well with my soul. No matter what I've gone through, it is well with my soul." And I thought, could it be? Could this be a message from Dad? And just then, the sunlight streamed right through a stained glass window, which was the face of Christ. And this beam of light came right down and illuminated the whole family sitting in the front row. If you look at the videotape of the funeral, it looks like there's an angel standing over my mother's head. It's that bright. And my brother, who doesn't go to church, grabbed my mother's hand and said, "Mom, Dad is here." You see, what he had gone through, that suffering that the Lord had put him through at the end of his life, was preparation for the glory of heaven that he was going to experience after his death. My father was a man who, if he had any weakness, it was punctuality. He would often be late for appointments. But this is one appointment he wasn't late for. His appointment with God, he was right on time. This has made me think a lot about the situation with euthanasia in Canada. Because I wonder if those who are choosing euthanasia have anyone in their lives who can ask the question, who can show them enough care so that they recognize that life is worth living. Right now in Canada, the people who do the assessments don't do that counseling. They have a checklist. They come in. I heard in BC, I was in BC giving a talk, and one of the nurses said that she had timed an assessment. It was 12 minutes long. I wonder in 12 minutes whether someone can get to that level of depth of concern to try to determine what the reason is and to see if there are alternatives to deal with it. Or whether, like many say, it's just a checklist where if you qualify in the mind of the doctor doing the assessment, if you check off the boxes, then you qualify. See, most people think that people choose MAID because of concern about pain. And what Dr. Cooper will tell you is that most pain can be dealt with at end of life with proper palliative care. But the problem is that only 30 to 50% of Canadians have access to palliative care in Canada. There isn't sufficient service to go around. And so the type of care and support that my father got would not necessarily be available to anyone. To make matters worse, MAID has now been expanded to include people with disabilities, people with mental health concerns, and people with chronic illness. And there are currently proposals to expand MAID to children, people with dementia who have an advanced directive, and according to the College of Physicians of Quebec, even infants under the age of 1. The concern is how many people will die for a lack of care. When MAID for people with psychiatric illness becomes legal next spring, it will take a waiting period of 3 months for someone with a psychiatric illness to get euthanasia. It takes 6 months on average across Canada to get access to a psychiatrist's visit. Now, sometimes even believers can be scared of death. and vulnerability and dependence on other people, because even we no longer trust God to be our source of strength in times of trouble. We're not sure that we're loved or lovable, or that God really cares about us. And we feel like we have to solve our problems on our own. But remember, for those who fear my name, there will arise a Sun of Justice with its healing rays. Brothers and sisters in Christ, we can rely on God. We can live in hope. The Church has been very clear to tell us that human dignity comes from God's love for us. God created us in his image. God sent his only Son, Jesus Christ, into the world to save us from sin so that we can have eternity with him. God comes into the world as the Holy Spirit, the Helper, who will enter into us. We will receive the very body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. That's how much he loves us. That dignity can't be taken away by anybody, by any law of the state, or even by our own decision. Our lives are a gift from God, and they're meant to be treasured in good times and in bad times. People are not disposable the way products are. In 2021, a document was released by the Vatican called Samaritanus Bonus, or the Good Samaritan. It was signed by Pope Francis, and it clearly laid out the Church's teaching on euthanasia. What it taught was that ending a person's life through euthanasia or MAID is opposed to the fifth commandment, you shall not kill. The Pope's document calls euthanasia intrinsically evil. That is, it's wrong in every circumstance. No matter how good the intention is, you cannot justify euthanasia. If you freely choose to have MAID and are aware of what you're doing, you could be committing a mortal sin, which can separate you forever from your relationship with Christ. Now, the Catechism deals with what we might call regular suicide and says that there is some room there because people sometimes commit suicide without being aware of what they're doing. But MAID is insidious because it's different than a normal suicide. You have to be in a sound mind to make the choice. You have to know exactly what you're doing. And we're all deemed to know that it's wrong to commit murder. So we have to be very clear in helping our brothers and sisters understand how dangerous it is to consider MAID and to think that this is somehow a dignified death. My father had a dignified death. My father glorified the Lord until the day of his death, and he lived in obedience to what God had called him to. He passed through his time of purgatory and went into eternity in heaven. Now, we can't judge whether someone is in heaven or hell, of course. But the reality is that when you start doing things that are involved, that break the 10 Commandments, like murder, you're putting your salvation at risk. If any of you or anyone you know is considering taking this step, we strongly encourage you to reconsider and reach out to the clergy for clarification and support. And if someone you know or a family member has ended their life through MAID, we need to pray for them that the Lord, in his infinite mercy, will not exclude them from his embrace. But this is important. If you're involved in pastoral care or taking the Eucharist to shut-ins, all of a sudden now you're on the front line of supporting vulnerable people. Your care for them, your concern for them, your willingness to support them may actually mean the difference between them choosing life or them choosing death. And there are clear consequences to this decision for Catholics. If someone is planning on choosing MAID, they may not receive the last rites, confession, anointing, and viaticum. This concern goes on to affect Catholic physicians, legislators, and hospitals. All can be implicated spiritually if they formally cooperate in this evil. Now, why is the Church so deeply opposed to this practice? By choosing MAID, we're essentially turning our backs on God and the life that He has given us. We are saying, yes, Lord, I accept all the good things you've given me, but now that the sky appears a little dark, I don't like it. I want to get out of it now. Christians are simply stewards of the life that God has given us. We live and we die for Christ. We have given ourselves over to Him. It is Christ who has brought us into this world, and Christ who decides when we should leave. If our Lord and Savior embraced the cross, so must we as His followers. Our suffering, when joined to that of our Savior's, can be redemptive. You remember the phrase, offer it up? That's sometimes what we need to do. God can use our suffering to be redemptive and bring about miracles in our lives and those we love. Secondly, Jesus Himself identifies with the vulnerable. He says, whatever you do to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you do it to me. While it's true that people must consent to MAID, in other words, they must sign the form before it's administered, people might choose it because they've given up on living under the weight of a society that just doesn't care. Just a few months ago, there was a widely publicized story about a woman in Ontario with environmental sensitivities who could not find proper housing. She chose to have MAID administered, but she left a videotape with her family explaining that the reason she had chosen MAID was because she could not find adequate housing. Her friends tried to have a GoFundMe campaign, and they couldn't raise enough money, so she decided to go for MAID. And there are numerous cases like this. In the fall, almost every week, there was an article in the National Post talking about another vulnerable person who had chosen to end their life because they did not have the proper supports. There are currently insufficient services in Canada for palliative care, support for the disabled, and the mentally ill. And you all know how challenged our healthcare system is, especially during the period of COVID-19 and the time afterwards. People should not choose death simply because the system has failed them. Now, for this reason, the organization I work with has started a project called No Options, No Choice. And when you arrived today, you were given a flyer that explains that. There's a website, nooptionsnochoice.com. If you go to that website and put in your name and address, you will be able to immediately, like within 1 minute or 2 minutes, get a sample email that you can send to your MLA. What we're doing is we're trying to get as many emails as we can across Canada to our MLAs to encourage them to provide support for palliative care, psychiatric services, and support for people with disabilities. Because it should not be acceptable to us as Canadians that MAID is provided consistently across Canada while people cannot get access to these services that will be alternatives to MAID. There's also an essential role for the Church to play. We're also called as the Church to care for others in their time of need. We need to ensure that everyone within our Christian community and outside of it knows that they are loved by God and have dignity. The early church, during the Roman Empire, used to have a practice. It was common among some of the Roman pagan religions to leave their infants outside to the elements to have them eaten by animals. It was a type of fertility sacrifice. And Christians would sneak out and take these little babies and bring them and bring them up themselves. Well, we're getting to the point where vulnerable people are at risk in our country. And getting to the point where individual Christians and groups of Christians will need to rally around the vulnerable to care for them and support them and to give them a reason for living. Many give up because of isolation and loneliness and ask for MAID. We need to be there to support them, not to kill them. I'm here tonight to ask you to participate in this campaign and to also participate in your lives, in the good work that you do, supporting family members, people within the parish community and people in your larger community, to support them. But most of all, I think we have to recapture our sense of strength. So many things happen in our society, and oftentimes we Christians just say, what can we do about it? How can we make a difference? Well, we can all make a difference individually in terms of the way you care for the vulnerable in your own life. I think we can also make a difference as a group. And participating in projects like this helps those in public life realize that there are people out here who are very, very concerned about the way that MAID has developed in Canada. The only way I can see to change this is through a groundswell of support, for people to be outraged and say, this is not my Canada. We need to have a solid ethic of life within our healthcare system. And it should not be acceptable that we have people within it that are promoting the death of patients. God bless you. I'm going to invite Phil to come up now and give the perspective of the palliative care physician.
Thank you, Larry. I'd like to start with a story. Palliative care is great for stories. It is? Can you not hear me? Can you put it up a little bit higher? Thank you. Can you hear me now? Is that better? I'd like to start with a story. Palliative care provides a great fund of stories. This morning, I visited at home a woman in her early 60s who I've known and followed for the last 5 years or so, initially wearing my oncology hat with her diagnosis of lung cancer, and in more recent years, wearing my palliative care hat. When I saw her this morning, she had just returned from taking her dog for their regular daily 3-mile walk. I reminded her that 3 years ago, I came to see her in hospital, and she begged me to put her out of her misery. She said, I don't want to go on living like this one more minute, let alone one more day. You have to do something. I know it's legal now. I know it's in your power to make that happen. Now, when I hear people say things like that, as a palliative care physician, that is a cue to begin a palliative care conversation. So I said to her, then tell me about your suffering. How are you suffering? She said, my life is not worth living. I can't breathe. I have pain. I'm anxious, I can't relax, I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can't do anything. She was exhibiting what Dame Cicely Saunders, the founder of hospice palliative care worldwide, was the first to describe as total pain. Her pain was not just physical, it was emotional, psychological, spiritual, existential pain. There was no pill to fix her pain. But we dealt with her symptoms, and we went through with the palliative care team's interventions, and she had the treatments for her cancers. And 3 years later, she's enjoying an excellent quality of life, not dying from her cancer, but living with it. And I reminded her this morning of that conversation that we had had 3 years ago. And she said to me, well, it's a good thing you didn't sympathize with the idea of MAID, otherwise I wouldn't be here. And I've had 3 good years so far, and probably many more to come. One of the great joys and rewards of palliative care is helping people to find meaning in their suffering, to relieve wherever possible, but if not possible, to find meaning in their suffering. And meaning is the great antidote to suffering. I'd like to just briefly touch on three aspects of this hugely important and very challenging issue, which I have to say has always affected me in a visceral way, like nothing else in my nearly 50 years in medicine. I'm an Anglican priest, a cradle Anglican, and from the Christian perspective, I find nothing in Scripture or in the 2,000 years of teachings of the Church that says that it is ever acceptable to end a life intentionally. It is un-Christian. As a physician, for the first 40 years of my professional life, I was taught, I believed, I practiced the belief that supporting life, preventing death, relieving suffering was my role, my mission, my goal in medicine. No one ever said that it would be ethical to intentionally end a life. And until 7 years ago, it was neither ethical nor was it legal. The fact that it became legal in Canada 6-7 years ago, to my mind, in my personal belief, does not make it ethical. It is still, to me, an unethical practice. As a palliative care physician, MAID is the antithesis of palliative care. It has no place in palliative care. MAID is not mentioned in any of the definitions of palliative care from the World Health Organization down. The Canadian Society of Palliative Care Physicians, which is the national group to which I belong, a couple of years ago put out a joint statement with the Canadian Society of Hospice Palliative Care, two national groups that speak for palliative care, saying explicitly and jointly, MAID is not part of palliative care. A lot of people think it is. One of the things that we fear in palliative care is that those who are referred into the palliative care system believe that this is the beginning of our slippery slope towards ending their lives. I spend a lot of time explaining to people what palliative care is and is not. I tell people I spend 95% of my time helping people to live, and perhaps 5% of my time helping people to die. That's what palliative care is. But most people believe, and with good reason, that the referral to palliative care means there's nothing that can be done, it's game over, I'm going to them for my end-of-life care. And that's very sad, because that is not what palliative care is about. Being around people who know their own mortality and know the value of every day is, perhaps ironically, perhaps paradoxically, a hugely life-affirming experience that I am privileged to have every day that I go to work. We will all suffer, and we will all die, no matter how much we might try to deny that fact. Euthanasia is the antithesis of palliative care, and most palliative care physicians in this country believe that to be the case. We do not live and we do not die alone. There is huge value placed in the 21st century on this very individualistic value, I would call it narcissistically so, of autonomy. If you happen to find the website for Dying with Dignity, as it is called, that is the pro-euthanasia lobby, you will find they say, banner headline, "Your life your choice. When people say things like that to me, I say, you're asking me as a physician to help you commit suicide. Ask yourself, when people commit suicide for real, does anyone celebrate? Does anyone say, yes, they were being autonomous, they were doing things their way, they were exercising their own freedom and autonomy by ending their lives? That's not what we say. What we say is, where did we fail in being unable to help that person find meaning in their suffering? That their lives were so meaningless that the only way they could see forward was to end their lives. No one celebrates suicide. No one should celebrate medical assistance in dying. I would invite you to check the website on the Health Canada site that lists the statistics around MAID. It's easily found if you just search MAID Canada report. Every year since 2019, Health Canada has put out a report on the statistics of the numbers and the people involved since this became legal in 2016. I'll give you a couple of the numbers which perhaps will put this in some perspective for you. The most recent is the third annual report, which Larry made reference to a moment ago, which covers the numbers up until the complete calendar year 2021. The numbers for 2022 are not yet available, so this is 2021. In 2021, there were 10,000 MAID deaths in Canada. There were 245 in this province of Nova Scotia. Canada-wide, that's about 3.3% of all deaths. Less in Newfoundland, about 1%, more, as Larry said, in BC. 91% of MAID requests went on to a MAID procedure. 91. So if you ask for it, you're very probably going to get it. Why do people ask for it? Mostly it's for cancer, 66%. 2/3 it was for cancer, and most of those are lung cancer. Only about 12%, I was surprised to see, are for neurological diagnoses. And of course, the neurological diagnosis that we all fear most is ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. For those for whom death was not reasonably foreseeable, which was one of the criteria initially, most of those are people with Lou Gehrig's disease, whose deaths may not be reasonably foreseeable but are inevitable. When asked why they wanted to receive MAID, 86% said it was because of a loss of ability to engage in meaningful activities. There's that word again, meaning. 86%. That was the reason they wanted to end their lives. They could not engage in meaningful activities. 54% said it was because of loss of dignity. And there's that word again. The word that has been hijacked, I believe, by the pro-death movement, saying or implying that the only way to have a dignified death is euthanasia, which is a huge insult to those of us in palliative care who hold great value on dignity. In fact, all the language we use has been perverted, subverted, even euthanasia itself. Euthanasia is a Greek word which means good death. That's what I try to help people to achieve. That's a positive thing in my world, a good death. Euthanasia doesn't mean actively killing someone. Dying with dignity is what I try to achieve for everyone I look after. It shouldn't mean ending someone's life with a lethal injection. Even the word medical assistance in dying That's what I do. That's my job. That's not something for someone to do with a needle and a lethal injection. Loss of dignity is one of the reasons given. One of the saddest, and Larry referred to this as well, the saddest reason, a third of all people said that they wanted their lives to be ended because they regarded themselves as a burden on their family or on the healthcare system. They'd be better off without me. That's a reason to end a life. And 17% said they wanted to die because they were lonely. Surely we can do better in our modern, civilized, advanced society than let people die for lack of basic resources, simple interventions, friendship, community. We do not live alone, we do not die alone. Another Anglican priest, John Donne, metaphysical poet in the 17th century, said, "No man is an island. Every man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. Therefore do not send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." We live in community, we live in family, we live in society. We do not live and we do not die like atoms, autonomous, solitary. We should not. We need not. One of the most banal reasons for palliative care to object to MAID is the fact that it is simply unnecessary. We could always help people whose suffering was so extreme at the end of life that the only way to relieve that suffering was to have them be asleep. We can do that. We could always do that ethically, and we still do that now, even at St. Martha's, occasionally, as a last resort. We call it palliative sedation. If someone is in such pain, such distress, delirium, seizures, nausea, that the only way to relieve their suffering is to have them asleep, we can do that and allow them to die naturally and comfortably and peacefully. We didn't need to have a change in the law. Around the time that we were debating this in Ottawa in around 2015, you may not know, but the same debate was happening in the UK, a country, a culture, a society not so different from our own. A free vote in Parliament to change the law to permit euthanasia. It was almost unanimously rejected. Why? Because people in the UK at that time were confident that they would have access to palliative care. They didn't need euthanasia if they had palliative care. At that time, only about 30%, as Larry says now, perhaps about 50% of Canadians are confident in having access to quality palliative care so that they don't need euthanasia. So, 3 points. From the Christian perspective, in my belief, it is unchristian. From the medical perspective, my personal belief is that it is and remains unethical. From the palliative care perspective, I believe it is unnecessary. 3 good reasons for me to refuse to have anything to do with this process. For me, MAID is a failure. If somebody that I'm looking after as a palliative care physician asks for MAID and insists on going through with it, I'm obliged to make that possible by referring them to someone else who can help them. I am also protected by law to conscientiously refuse to be that person. But I will have failed if they only can see the future in that way. I will have failed, just as society has failed when people commit suicide for real. I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. I think we'd all be very fortunate to have you as a physician at end of life because of your passionate dedication to your patients and to their well-being, even to the point of putting your career aspirations second. And that's the type of dedication we need. So thank you very much. We're happy to take questions now, or if you have comments. Because of the PA system, it would be better if you could write your question down and just pass it up to the front, and we'll answer them that way. So if you have a slip of paper or something there and a pen, just jot down your question, put up your hand, I'll come and get it, and we'll answer any questions that you may have. Anyone have any questions or comments? Yes.
I have a question in regards to national politics. Can we have people who are really concerned regarding the pro-life cause, which includes euthanasia, abortion, etc.? How do you feel as to the reason why there's such negativity in supporting people who are on the line trying to bring about pro-life issues which are being held back by the news media, by the clergy, by the politicians, etc.? We have a vacuum in our society where this information is not being let out. And many people are not aware that the doctor and yourself are just presenting. We're in a vacuum. The media, I'm not mentioning anyone in particular or any group in particular because I know what could happen. I'm just saying media. We are in a vacuum. Many people have no concept of what the terrible stuff is happening in terms of what I just mentioned, and especially in abortion, with infanticide, etc., etc., etc. So I just, how do you feel as to what we as a society are going to be able to do, especially now with the lack of God in our society, which is trying to be driven out? How are we going to be able to comprehend and fight against the ex-prime minister that we now have leading our country in a very, very difficult situation?
So the question is, there's a sense or a feeling that there's like an information vacuum in our society. So the information that Dr. Cooper and I explained tonight, some of you may not even have known about this or even known that it existed. So the question is, how are we going to fight against this? Just last Thursday, I was in Ottawa for the March for Life, and it's a similar sort of issue there. In 2015, I was honored to be able to go with Cardinal Collins from Toronto, and we met with a number of high-ranking federal politicians on these issues. The problem we have now in Canada is it is seen to be a sin to be pro-life. And so that we see that the major party, the Liberals, the Prime Minister in 2015, when he came in, he said no one can sit in Parliament as a Liberal member if they are pro-life. So that right away set the tenor for that. In addition, what we're finding is that even the Conservative Party now is very, very nervous about having a pro-life candidate for Prime Minister. And we know that the NDP is very much pro-choice. In addition, I think that it's fair to say that there is a certain amount of media bias, especially with the state-funded broadcaster. I want everyone to know that I faced Anna Maria Tremonti on The Current I live to tell the tale. But I don't, I'm going to turn, the situation we have in Canada is an awful situation, okay? And it's leading to the whole society going into the dumpster. The trajectory, if we continue going the way we're going, because we're moving at a faster and faster rate, the trajectory is we'll be killing, well, currently in Victoria, BC, 20% of all deaths are MAID deaths. So that's the future that we have looking ahead of us. If they start euthanizing infants, then just raising the age will be the next thing, and then people will be euthanized without their consent. So a lot of people will say to me, you know, why are you so upset about this? And I'll say, because I can see into the future. I saw into the future already that we're here, because just before this was legalized, they went over to Belgium and Holland, and the writing was on the wall there. Okay, anybody who had eyes to see could see. The problem we have in Canada right now is because our politicians refuse to have a spine, they're letting the courts make the moral decisions, and the courts are making moral decisions based on the needs of an individual, not on the base of all society. Okay, so this is a constitutional crisis we're having. In addition to that, we have media that are unwilling to do anything that's not politically correct, so that it becomes a negative if anyone speaks in favor of life. And especially Christians right now, Catholics or Christians in Canada, are seen to be the new pariahs, because there are many disability groups who won't even work with us because we're a Christian group. Okay, so the hope, and this is what you're asking, the hope is here in this church right now. The question is whether you, each of you individually, and me, will shake off the stupor that we Canadians have and start having a backbone, each of us. Whether we will be prepared to be vocal and risk conflict. Now, I want you to know I'm not speaking down to you here. I speak with you because I am a Canadian too. I am as adverse to conflict as you are. I want everyone to like me. But my question is, we're headed, I don't think this is an exaggeration, we're headed into the type of destruction that was prevalent in Germany in the 1930s. I don't think this is an exaggeration. And you and I are silent. How will we explain this to our grandchildren? See, I think that the reason we're in the state that we're in is because people just haven't stood up. I didn't stand up. I mean, I was off doing stuff for most of my life. I was concerned about this issue. It was only until my son decided to go into medical school that I thought, good grief, this guy's not going to be able to practice. Right? It was only until it hit me personally that then I said, I better take this job. So I've been taking this job for the last 12 years. Every day when I wake up, I don't want to go to work because I'm constantly a sign of contradiction to this society. The society is headed in this direction, and I and members of our association are headed in the other direction. And so are you, by the sounds of things. Well, if we had enough of us heading in that direction, if every time your MP in the next election comes to get your vote, and you say, how did you vote on MAID? You don't think eventually they wouldn't turn tide? They only care about getting elected. But the thing that frustrates me is I don't know how to get the message out. We spent $40,000 on a social media campaign to get No Options, No Choice out because we can't go to the media. We can't take our message to the media and expect that it's going to get relayed. That's how bad it is. They're going to twist it. They'll twist it around. So we're going directly to the people, social media. So we sent 8,500 letters to politicians. I need another $40,000. I need another $40,000. We're basically doing the work of the media for them to get past the media and get directly to the people. If you've got time in your hands, you could pray for us. That'd be a good start. But also to join us and to do your own initiatives. And next time you're in the superstore and you bump into your MLA, give them an earful. What are you doing on mental health care? How is it that you're allowing MAID to be legalized for people with psychiatric illness, and it takes 6 months in this province to see a psychiatrist? You can disagree with the tactics of the truckers in Ottawa, and I know many of you do, but the mandate's ended. We could sit back and just be quiet and not do anything. And like I said, it won't be too long before someone you love in your family, if you have an autistic grandson, if you have somebody who suffers from depression and mental illness, one day they're there, the next day they're gone. And there's no appeal. So we either act now or we don't. Other questions? Yes. Thank you. What obligations are on doctors to promote or inform people of the option of MAID? What obligations are on doctors to promote or inform people of the option of MAID?
That's an excellent question, and one that bothers me a lot, because I'm afraid there's a generational change taking place. Is that better? Yeah. There's a generational change taking place. We're all of a certain age, most of us, and this is not hard for us to accept, but the generations coming behind us, some of my fellow professionals, even in St. Martha's Hospital, do not feel the same way that I feel about this issue. There are some who would say that MAID should be offered just like any other management decision. Goals of care. Do you want to be resuscitated? Do you want to be in hospital for your end-of-life care? Do you want MAID? Tick the box. That's what a lot of people think. I personally think it is never, ever acceptable to raise the issue of MAID to somebody who hasn't raised it themselves or someone in their family. Everyone knows this is legal. Everyone knows they can ask for it. But I believe they have to ask for it before they get it. And that has got me into some personal difficulties over the years since MAID became legal, I have to tell you. I was accused about a year after the death of someone that I was looking after who had a difficult death. I was accused by his grieving spouse of having denied him the MAID which he wanted. And the only reason that formal complaint was made against me was because somebody saw on YouTube a presentation, something like this, that I had given my views, and they didn't realize when I was looking after their spouse, they had no idea that I felt like this. And when I went back with the nurses who had been with me on the occasions of the many occasions of visiting with this family, I was quite close to this family as this man was dying of cancer. I said, am I willfully deaf to this? Do I just not want to hear it? Did you hear anyone ever ask or mention or say, I don't want to carry on living like this, I want it to be over, or some coded alternative to actually saying the word MAID? And nobody heard it. And in the end, when it came to a formal inquiry that I had to defend myself, the family admitted, no one actually raised it. He didn't before he died. No one in the family actually asked for it. So I was asked, this is by the College of Physicians and Surgeons, an inquiry. So, Dr. Cooper, in your previous life, you were a surgeon. Before you took anyone to the operating room, you would have discussed all the available options with them before they signed their consent, would you not? And I said, yes. So what's so different about this? I said, that is a totally false analogy. If a young woman comes to my office with a positive pregnancy test, am I supposed to say to her, you realize you have a choice here? I mean, that's absurd. It is, if that's what we've come to, that is absurd. So if somebody asks me, and it has happened on several occasions over the years since it's become legal, somebody asks me, I say, I try to find out why, I try to do something to make the suffering less, but if they insist on pursuing that course of action, I am obliged, and I would never refuse, I cannot refuse, to make what's called an effective referral. That is to ask somebody else who I know will be sympathetic to see that person and take over their care. And I'm obliged to maintain the continuity of care until that is taken over. It's happened on, I think, 2 or 3 occasions to me after looking after thousands of people at the end of their lives over the last 12 years that I've been doing palliative care. And they've been failures in my mind. It has happened, but it is uncommon. It's rare. On much more common occasions, I've had people say, I don't want to go on living like this, I'm just so miserable, without actually asking the direct question. And I'll say, tell me, what's making you miserable? How are you suffering? What can we do to fix it? And on many occasions, I have had the gratifying experience of having people say to me 6, 12 months later, thank you for the gift of those months that I did not think I wanted to have. You made these simple interventions, and my life was meaningful again. I've enjoyed the last months of my life that I didn't think I wanted. I wanted it over. If you had been a physician who was prepared to sign the papers, I would be dead. And I would have missed, and my family with me would have missed those precious months of being able to settle my affairs, establish my legacy, tidy up my life before I leave it. That's the experience in palliative care that I have. But if people insist, I'm obliged to say yes. But I will continue to insist that it is never appropriate to raise that subject unless it has been asked for by the patient or the family. But a lot of younger physicians will say, I had a call in the early years of the law changing from fellow Anglican priests. There was one priest who called me and he said, in great distress, I have been following this woman in my congregation for 30 years. She suffers with arthritis, she's got mobility issues, she has a terrible time, but she carries on with her life. Her family physician of many years retired and was replaced by a young family physician who came in and looked at her chart and the long list of comorbidities on her chart and said, you realize you don't have to go on living like this? And she said, what do you mean? She said, well, you could have MAID. You would qualify for MAID. She said, but that's absurd. That's not what I'm looking for. I want you to help me with my symptoms. I don't want you to end my life, for heaven's sake. But that is the direction in which our society is moving. And it's funny that Larry talks about the early church, because the early church was countercultural. Early Christianity was countercultural to the Roman culture of the time. In a strange way, after 2,000 years of Christendom running the show, we are again, as Christians, becoming countercultural. This sort of stuff is not mainline culture any longer. We are the exceptions rather than the rule, is the sad reality of it. But I'm here to tell you that as long as that is called St. Martha's Hospital, there will be no MAID in its walls. Because in 1996, 26 years ago, with amazing foresight, the Sisters of St. Martha, when they handed over that building to the government of Nova Scotia, signed a mission assurance agreement with the government that said in 1996, this is in the days of the Sue Rodriguez case in the Supreme Court, the first case, the government agreed that there would be Catholic health care at St. Martha's in perpetuity, that there would never be abortions, there would never be euthanasia in St. Martha's Hospital. If you walk into the hospital, by the elevator on every floor, there's a statement of the hospital's mission. And the number one value is respect for life in all its stages. And the day that hospital is forced by the government to comply with what is happening in every other hospital in this province, except St. Martha's, is the day it will cease to be St. Martha's Hospital. I can assure you of that, because the sisters won't stand behind it. Our fear is that that mission agreement may not withstand a charter challenge. My nightmare scenario is of somebody coming into our hospital in the palliative care unit, having a miserable, miserable time dying, and saying, I want MAID. It's legal. I qualify for it. This is a publicly funded hospital. You better make it happen, or else. And the concern is, the real fear is that a Charter of Rights challenge will trump, excuse my language, will trump the St. Martha's Mission Agreement with the government signed in 1996. I mean, I'm afraid that's the reality. But if that happens, it will no longer continue to be St. Martha's Hospital. Of that you can be sure. And think what we would lose after more than 100 years.
I just wanted to cover 2 points in relation to what you said. I hope you understand that good Christian doctors like Philip are threatened by what's happening. I want you all to go away from here thinking about this, because it's very common. My wife's a Catholic doctor, and parishioners are often coming to me and saying, oh, it's so wonderful to have a Catholic doctor. But I get a little irritated because I go, well, what are you doing to help protect her? Because Philip and other Christian doctors are under threat all the time. The first thing he mentioned is that Nova Scotia has the worst conscience protection legislation in the country. You may not realize that. You're required in Nova Scotia to provide a written formal referral for some of these contentious procedures like abortion and euthanasia. In Catholic moral theology, which doesn't apply to Philip because he's Anglican, but in Catholic moral theology, a referral is morally equivalent to actually performing the action. Matter of fact, the recent document that came from Rome said that doctors may not make referrals. Okay, so if you're a Catholic doctor, you may not refer. It's the same thing as actually doing it. The second thing is that there is a standard that's been developed by Health Canada that our registrar of the college here was actively involved with. And this standard has been developed by Health Canada, and the idea is that it would be sent out to every regulator, every medical regulator in Canada. And this standard requires that Philip would advise every patient who might qualify about the availability of MAID. And since our registrar in Nova Scotia was involved in the committee that developed the standard, it's likely that he will try to implement that in Nova Scotia. Now, why is it wrong to ask a doctor to advise about the availability of MAID? First thing is the emotional impact on the patient. Patients are very vulnerable, and when a doctor says to you, well, you know, you could try MAID, that kind of sounds like a recommendation, doesn't it? The second thing is that where do you draw the line? So, for instance, once MAID is available for people with psychiatric illness, what if a patient says to their psychiatrist, I really have been thinking about killing myself? At that point, what does the psychiatrist do? Do they try to treat the person, or do they send them for a MAID referral? Imagine if you have a son or a grandson who jumps in the wrong end of a pool one night from perhaps having too much to drink, and they wake up the next morning as a quadriplegic. You want the doctor to be saying to them, you know, you qualify for MAID. The problem we have here is that MAID is treated like any other medical procedure, like getting your appendix out. So now we have a healthcare system where there are doctors like Dr. Cooper who believe that his role is to heal and to promote life. And there are doctors who are on the other side of this who feel that their role is to prevent suffering, which can include killing the patient. So when you go in as a patient, you're going to be asked, do you want to end your life? And you might not have even been thinking about it. But let's say you're at a low ebb. Let's say you're depressed. Let's say you have other concerns. Let's say your husband or wife just left you. And you actually feel like dying. You're going to want to go to Philip, aren't you? Because he's already explained some of his patients are alive 3 years later and they're thanking him. But you might not be going to Philip at all. You may be going to a doctor who believes in autonomy so much that if you want to die, then he should kill you. You see the problem? We're paying for a healthcare system that promotes life, and we're getting a healthcare system that promotes death. It's so bad that we've had, I don't know if this has happened to you or not, but we've had doctors have told me that they have been criticized by colleagues and by family members because they've spoken to a patient who has decided for MAID with the patient's consent, and the patient has changed their mind. And the family and the colleagues have criticized the doctor for talking to the patient about alternatives. We've had situations where the patient is Catholic and they've invited a priest in to talk to them about it. The priest has explained to them this is against the teachings of the church. The person has changed their mind, decided no to MAID. A doctor who I trust told me that the resident said they shouldn't allow priests into the hospital. This is the most egregious scenario. I had a lawyer tell me that he was helping this lady who was an elderly spinster, had no family. She hired him to be her substitute decision maker. And he was a good Catholic boy, and so he did more, he would go in sometimes and read the scriptures to her to cheer her up a bit. He didn't charge for it, I want you to know. He's a good lawyer. And so anyway, her doctor suggested to her that she might consider MAID. She had the discussion with the lawyer. After their discussion, she changed her mind, didn't want to go with MAID. But that lawyer was pulled aside by her physician, who said, you shouldn't talk to her about these things, you're only upsetting her. Now this is a lawyer, and this is a solicitor-client relationship. And the doctor is trying to keep the lawyer away from the patient. So I say these things just not to scare you, but to make you aware of how the culture of medicine has dramatically changed by this. Yeah. Human dignity comes from God. That's what we believe as Catholics. And if someone like my dad believes that they no longer have any dignity, you can talk to them and you can support them and love them, and they can feel that they have dignity. But by the same token, if they encounter someone who believes that their expression of suffering is actually a plea for death, that can be provided. And in Canada, there's no waiting period. Anyway, please pray. If you know any Christian or Catholic doctors, please pray for them and support them. Other questions? Yes.
I have a question. When we talk about suicide, and a person dies by suicide, so they die by suicide, they commit suicide.
Yes.
So which is it?
You mean for suicide? Well, it could be either. You could phrase it either, commit suicide or die by suicide.
Okay. I'm a retired mental health nurse, and I've been to ICU to bring people back to mental health floor after when they're medically stabilized. So there's three things that they share when they're coming back. One is they're extremely
Sure.
And the third one is they're in huge fear. Fear that they almost did die by suicide. Now, to commit suicide, and this is from my experience only, but to commit suicide tags suicide as a criminal act. Have you ever heard that expressed in that way? In all your work and your research?
So the question is, the use of the term commit suicide makes it sound like a criminal offense. Yeah, was not a criminal offense. No.
But people talk and people refer to it generally, though he, she, they committed suicide. Committed. Well, committed means that it makes it sound like suicide is a criminal act.
Right.
It's not.
No.
Because the people are, when they reach that stage, they're desperate.
Yeah.
They're beyond desperate,
Yeah.
So to be on desperate is not something that is on a criminal level.
That they're choosing to do.
That they're choosing to do.
Right. Yeah.
So in my years, I had 22 years in acute care and crisis work, and then I did patient rights advisor afterwards when a person was involuntary. I did that for 14 years after that. And this has almost always been it, Then, through the studies that I did, and this is a few years ago now, but through all the studies I did, it was often pointed out to us that to be careful that we do not criminalize the act of suicide when it's not a criminal act, because of the desperation that is inside the person pushing. And then to have them walk back with you or come in a wheelchair or whatever and listen to their yet 3 more serious feelings of where they're halfway down the motor, that's huge. So it really, really, I feel strongly is that we should be careful with how we use that word, suicide. To die by suicide, or to almost die by suicide, not commit suicide. Commit suicide. That's just my thought.
Okay. Thank you. I think the point, I think the key point is not so much the. I think the key point is it's not so much the criminal aspect of it, but the moral aspect of it. Like, it's wrong to commit suicide, right? It's wrong to end your life by suicide. What can happen, though, is that someone can be suffering to such an extent, or they can be psychotic and not even be aware of their situation, and they're not really in control of themselves to be able to make that choice. So, in that sense, Catholic moral theology will say, well, what they're doing is wrong, but they didn't actually choose to do it because of their mental illness. What's different about MAID, though, is that you have to be competent to get MAID. And you have to know the nature and quality of your act. So, in that sense, getting MAID is different than what you might call normal suicide.
One of the topics that didn't come up in your discussion is the we live in a real world. We have to think about the availability of healthcare service, mental health care service, physical health care service. And if you're a parent of a child who has severe cancer, no matter how we talk about it, the person who maybe lives in cancer or tragedy has less access to really good palliative care, possibly than the one who lives on Cameron or Maggot Road, such as we do. I mean, that is the reality that we live in. It's not going to change. And I think that a lot of people think of MAID in terms of
in Holland, you can qualify for euthanasia if you have reached your 70th birthday. You can say, I've lived my life, I'm done, I'm just using up space and taking resources which could be used by other people, I'm checking out. You don't have to, no, but increasing numbers of people are. One statistic that I did not use from that report, the 2021 report, is that year on year, I said 10,000 in Canada for 2021. It is probably going to be 13 or 14,000 for 2022, because each year for the last 5 years, it's been an increment of 32%. So each year there are a third more procedures completed in this country than there were the year before. When you talk about, thank you for that comment, but what that reminds me of is that is somebody trying to commit suicide out of desperation, not out of dignity. That woman that I told you about, my story when I opened, she was desperate. That would not have been dying with dignity. She was desperate then. One thing that always strikes me is that if people really want to commit suicide, if they're really, really motivated to have their lives ended, why don't actually more people do it for themselves rather than implicating other people in the end of their life and making it somehow easier? Why ask a physician to do it for you if you're so committed? And when you look at the numbers, how many people, you have a choice. There are always choices. We're all for choice, right? You have the choice to have an intravenous injection, in other words, to have a physician or a nurse practitioner do it for you, or you can take it yourself. You can get a prescription for a lethal cocktail of pills and put them in your own mouth, in your own home, and commit suicide for real, with nobody helping you. Out of those 10,000 in 2021, do you know how many people actually did that? 6. 6 out of 10,000. Oh, I don't want to do this. You do it for me. Now, even making a referral, as Larry said, makes me complicit. But participating in the procedure, we haven't begun to see the mental health consequences for physicians involved in this practice in years to come when they reflect on what they have been doing. I remember the first presentation that I saw on MAID actually at an oncology conference in Halifax, and it was a really distressing situation for me, because the setup was, here is somebody coming to talk about first-hand experience of MAID, and this woman spoke about her husband who had Parkinson's disease. And I didn't recognize her, and I didn't know who she was talking about until I saw the slides of her husband projected above her head. And this was an old friend of mine, a fellow surgeon, an amazing guy who had lived an amazing life, was living life to the fullest, skied and climbed and flew his own plane and was active until in his 70s he got Parkinson's disease. And he decided, when that becomes legal, I want to be one of the first to get it. And she presented this in a group where it would have been impossible to challenge what she was saying. It would have been really cruel to challenge it in a public forum. But she had the physician who did the procedure with her, who just happened to be an obstetrician. Try and get your head around this. And what this young female obstetrician said, yeah, it's the circle of life. In the morning I deliver babies, in the afternoon I do MAID. No big deal. What's the problem? There was a huge problem. I had to leave. My blood pressure and it was just, but this was a friend of mine as well, and I was so disappointed that that's the way he felt he had to make the end of his life. But it's desperation, and that is not dignity. That is desperation. As people who actually try to commit suicide for themselves are desperate. Yeah.
On to your question over here, because I think it's a valid question. We've already had a palliative care nurse in Calgary tell me that she had a patient. She said, what? The patient said, I want MAID. She said, why is that? And the patient said, well, I want to give my bed to someone else because there's such a need in the healthcare system. If we had a healthcare system that was perfectly well run, that might be an argument. But the reality is the healthcare system is not well run. And the other reality is that what are our priorities? I heard the other day the current government is giving $40 million to promote abortion in other countries. If you end up choosing MAID, thinking that you're going to help the healthcare system, I would be concerned that you might be actually allowing the government to get off the hook. Because the problem is that MAID can act as a pressure valve on the healthcare system. And if there are changes that need to be made or additional funding that needs to be made, the politicians will always want to start a new program as opposed to fixing what's there currently, right? If more and more people choose MAID, then what's going to happen is that the government just has no incentive to actually improve the service. There should be palliative care for all those people in all those communities that you identified. There really should. And there's no reason why we can't have that. But it's just a question of will. And my concern is that if everyone says, well, just accepts the level of service we currently have, then there's no incentive for government to even try. And one thing I want to tell you is that I was talking to the lady who's the head of their association all over Canada last week, and she was telling me that it's very common across Canada for governments to tell palliative care services that they must have MAID as part of their service, and they don't give them any additional money for that. So what happens is that the service provided by doctors like Dr. Cooper actually goes down so that MAID can be provided. So they're actually taking money away from palliative care to put into MAID. So those are some of the concerns. The other thing is, I think we've all paid into the system throughout our lives, and when we need the system, it should be there for us. And we shouldn't have to be sacrificing our lives for the sake of health care.
BC? Yeah.
She's saying that it tends to be wealthier people that choose MAID.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, when people talk about choice, I like to talk about privilege, right? And I don't worry about privileged people. People have power in society. I don't worry about them getting access to services, but I worry about the people who are vulnerable and whether they get access to services. And it concerns me that people who are well-to-do, who are choosing MAID because they're used to controlling things in their lives, they want to continue to control their death, they're only looking at themselves. They're not looking at the impact on a vulnerable person of not having anyone to support them and being faced with this, and then in a dark moment choosing it. That's a problem.
So I'm recognizing the time, and I know some people have
We
to
had one question back here, Fawn.
Okay. Good.
Well, maybe I could quickly tackle that, Philip. In Nova Scotia, you're required to make a referral. This is a problem for Catholic physicians because our church tells us that a referral is essentially material cooperation in evil. So that's a problem. Our organization fought in court in Ontario. We lost the court case, but we were able to get the college to back off a little bit. We need to do the same fighting here. There's currently a standard that's been developed by Health Canada that is going to filter down to all of the colleges that will require, or will, if it's passed in each of the regulatory bodies, will require doctors to advise patients when they think there's a possibility that the patient might qualify. In terms of your attitude on healthcare, I completely agree with you. I think that we have to, as a church, develop our own institutions. One of the nice things about Canada, at least now, is that they're giving freedom to Catholic hospitals there are certain requirements, but generally speaking, Catholic hospitals in Canada have the freedom to be able to provide euthanasia-free spaces. And I think the solution is for the church to get back into the healthcare business. I think that's where I think that's where we're going to have to go. But Philip's there on the ground floor, so. Thank you.
So I know our discussion can,
yes.
Excuse me, and I know people do have to leave, and I thank you for coming and your presence here. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. We have Anne Callahan to thank you on behalf of the parish and all who are gathered. But I'd like to acknowledge Kathy Walsh, who was instrumental in putting all this together. And there is tea afterwards, so let's continue with tea and coffee afterwards, please. So I turn it over to Anne at this time.
On behalf of St. Ninian's Parish and the assembled members here, I wish to thank you very much for an extremely informative presentation, and I'm sure that you, looking around at these people, you have garnered a lot of support. So this is a small token of our appreciation for you.
So please, into the vestry, and there's beverages, and we'll continue the conversation. Well, there's a great deal to talk about.